What's up YouTube, Crispy Charizard here. Today I'll be discussing every single Pokemon form. I'll be explaining them and classifying them into categories. So let's get started. So after going through every single Pokemon with forms, and everything that is similar to forms but technically not forms, I've classified them into three big categories. Permanent forms, changeable forms, and other. Now, other, of course, is not forms at all, but I'm including them just because they're similar. Permanent forms have, of course, common forms, which are actually forms that are permanent. Then there's regional variants, which are one of the newest inclusions of forms in the Pokemon games. And then there's, of course, shiny Pokemon and gender differences. I include shiny Pokemon and gender differences because they're kind of on topic with Pokemon forms, and they are classified under permanent because you cannot change shiny Pokemon or a Pokemon's gender. But they are permanent, and I'm including them, but they're technically not forms. Next, under changeable forms, we have the battle exclusive forms and the non-battle exclusive forms. For now, we're dividing everything into battle exclusive, which means it has a form which can only be changed into or seen in battle. And of course, non-battle exclusive, meaning you have to change its forms outside of battle before anything else. And you cannot change its form in battle, except of course in one extreme circumstance. So under battle exclusive, we also have the different categories based on what kind of form it is. And the two main types are ability and used move, because that is the method by which it changes its form in battle. Of course, I included Mega Evolution, Primal Reversion, and Ultra Burst just because they are similar and belong in this category, even though they're technically not official forms. They are their own category, but I'll discuss them nevertheless. Under non-battle exclusive, I'll be discussing all the different methods that you can change of Pokemon's forms outside of battle, like overworld interaction, location of battle, ability, held item, key item, and used item. Now, of course, you probably already know that the Gen 5 only Season 1 is Deerling and Sawsbuck, and I'll be discussing them. But after Gen 5, they are actually in a completely different category. And of course, known move, which is a actual form change method in this category. So let's get started, and hopefully this won't take too long. So first we're discussing shiny Pokemon, but only briefly because these are not actual forms, but they are permanent. And, anyway, that's that. Next, we have gender differences. Now, little known fact, gender differences, ever since the early generations, have been included in Pokemon. Well, except not technically Gen 1, because in Gen 1 there were no genders at all. But ever since genders were introduced, they also introduced gender differences. And Gen 1, 2, 3, and 4 included dozens of them. Literally, or virtually every other Pokemon had a minute detail of a gender difference in the species sprite. For example, Pikachu's tail. The female has a tail that's shaped more like a heart than a thunderbolt. And that's just one example out of probably hundreds. Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3, Gen 4, they all had dozens and dozens, maybe even hundreds, of minute differences between genders. But it's not every Pokemon, but it's a lot. Then, maybe because of the change in artists in Gen 5, as I know that they had a new artist in Gen 5 introduced to help Sugimori design official Pokemon, they stopped doing that. In Gen 5, the only Pokemon with gender differences was Unfezant and Jellicent. And of course, Jellicent's whole evolution line. But unlike all the previous generations, instead of making dozens of Pokemon with minute, it's impossible to see the differences. But in Gen 5, they only included technically 3 species with gender differences, but they made the gender differences super obvious. So Unfezant, Jellicent, super obvious. The whole color scheme is different. You could almost say they're shiny because of how different they are, but they're not. They're just different genders, and these are not technically forms. They don't count. In Gen 6, they did the same thing with Pyroar and with Meowstic. However, for the first time, Meowstic, with the different genders, actually included having different move pools and different abilities. So it was a step in a new direction, but still, they did not include any other Pokemon with gender differences since then, and Gen 7 had included none, nothing like even these. So it's like they found out that this idea was too much trouble. It's not worth it, because back then they had to, they probably thought they had to give a gender difference to almost every Pokemon, like Venusaur's seed and Pikachu's tail and Camerup's humps, which are impossible to tell the difference, but apparently between male and female, one of them has bigger humps, but it's really, really hard to tell. The point is that they probably will not be doing gender differences ever again. And can you believe all this started with Nidoran? But back then, they didn't have even a concept of forms or genders, except the Nidoran, of course, which looks like different forms, but it's actually so different that back then they classified them as separate species. So Nidoran male and Nidoran female are technically different species, but today they wouldn't have done that. Today they would have made them either a gender difference, like Pikachu, or maybe even an extreme gender difference like Meowstic. But either way, today they would have made them the same species. Back then, of course, they didn't think of this far ahead, so they made Nidoran male and female completely different species. They are not forms either, so we will move along. Then, of course, we have actual forms, regional variants. They are permanent because you cannot change them. They are recently introduced, Gen 7, of course, but the only Pokemon that got regional variants are Pokemon from Gen 1. So this is hinting that other Pokemon will get regional variants in future generations, which I hope so. So far, only 18 species have gained a regional variant in Alola, so every one of these 18 species are from Kanto, and their Alola forms are, of course, from Alola, meaning there are 36 separate forms, because that's 18 times 2. And these are, of course, the most notable ones, the most famous ones, of course, but there are only 18 so far, and I'm predicting that in future generations, they will include Pokemon from Gen 2, 3, and so on, with new forms from new regions like Gen 8, maybe one based on Britain, like a video I recently made predicting that Gen 8 will be based on Britain. That's permanent regional variants. Moving on, we have the permanent Pikachu forms. These are forms of Pikachu that cannot be changed. So we have standard Pikachu, we have 7 cap Pikachus, and of course we have the base of Cosplay Pikachu. These are permanent. You cannot change any one to any other one. Then we have permanent Pichu. Spiky-haired Pichu. I should call them by their official names. Spiky-haired Pichu was an event-only Pichu a long time ago, I think in Gen 4. And it's a special kind of Pichu. And of course you cannot change its form, so it is a permanent form. Then we have the Unknown. The Unknown originally had 26 forms, the alphabet, and in Gen 3 they were added with the exclamation point and the question mark, so they got 2 punctuation forms, meaning now there are 28 forms of Unknown, and you cannot change them, so they are permanent. Then we have Wormadam. Wormadam has 3 permanent forms. Once a Burmy evolves into a Wormadam, it keeps its form, and it will never change again. Of course, all Wormadam are female, so only a female Burmy can evolve, and each one has a different moveset and different types, being Grass, Ground, and Steel, respectively. Shellos and Gastrodon also are permanent forms, whether they're in the West Sea or the East Sea of Sinnoh. They have different coloring, but otherwise they are identical. It's just aesthetic. They have no difference in type, ability, etc. Of course, Gastrodon and Shellos in Kalos can only be West Sea. In Alola, they can only be East Sea. And in Hoenn, they either one or the other only based on the game Omega Ruby or Alpha Sapphire. Basculin is another permanent form. You cannot change between them. Little known fact. Originally, in Black and White, the blue-striped Basculin that you can get from a trade had an ability that no wild Basculin could get. And I don't know if this was an error or intentional, but it was none of its usual or even hidden abilities. It was Rockhead. The blue-striped Basculin that you get in a trade with Rockhead was not normal because wild Basculin, not even hidden ability Basculin, had Rockhead. But then in Black 2 and White 2, they fixed that and gave Rockhead as its normal ability, therefore making the difference between Red Stripe and Blue Stripe 1 or 2 difference in abilities. But they are permanent and you cannot change them. Now, post Gen 5. After Gen 5, meaning Gen 6 and 7, all Deerling and Sawsbuck are permanent. If you transfer any Deerling or Sawsbuck through Pokemon Bank to future games like Sun and Moon or X and Y or whatever, they will never change form, and they will evolve into their same form. The only way to change a Deerling or a Sawsbuck is in Gen 5, and we will discuss that later. But as of now, since there's no remakes of Gen 5 coming anytime soon, they are in the permanent category. Now, here's an obscure one because this form is purely internal. It is internal in the game's code. That is a difference between a Greninja with Battle Bond and a Greninja without Battle Bond. Meaning, imagine the Greninja on the left has either Torrent or Protean, meaning it's a regular Greninja. And the one on the right has Battle Bond, but of course it hasn't activated, so it looks like just any other Greninja. But they are not the same Greninja because internally in the game's code, Battle Bond Greninja are considered a separate form from non-Battle Bond Greninja. So technically, this counts as a different form of Greninja. And they are permanent because you can never change, and they're not even breedable. Of course, the form you see in battle, when Battle Bond activates and it turns into Ash Greninja, that's a separate form altogether. Because it changes in battle, but that is to discuss later. Next, we have Vivillon. Vivillon has 18 standard permanent forms. You cannot change them, and the only way to get each one is to have your game have a set GPS location put into it, which of course cannot be changed, meaning you probably will put the one where you live. Of course, if you have a new 3DS or you know how to change it, which I'm not an expert on, you could technically get another one, but if it's not changeable, you'll never get them all without trading. And of course, some of these are only obtainable in very, very remote locations where I doubt many people play Pokemon. Like, I don't know, Siberia, like northern Canada, the tundra, Polynesia, somewhere in the jungles of South America or Africa or the Middle East. You know, I'm sure people play Pokemon everywhere, but most of these locations aren't as prevalent with Pokemon players. So collecting these would be an interesting challenge. Of course, there are also 2 additional forms that are event only, the Pokeball and the Fancy patterns, so there are a total of 20 Vivillon patterns. Then Flabebe, Floette, and Florges each have 5 different forms. So between the 3 of them, that's 15 forms, and these forms are of course the color of their flowering. So I doubt it's even biological, but that's official forms for you. Additionally, Floette has an illegitimate form, which was intended to be event only, but it's illegitimate because the event was never officially distributed. And this Floette has different coloring, being red and blue instead of green, which is the coloring of the French flag, which is a reference to Colossus being based on France. And its flower is also different because it's based on the ultimate weapon built by AZ. So AZ's Floette is unique and illegitimate, so you can only get it through hacking, but it exists in the game's code of X and Y. Pumpkaboo and Gourgeist. They each have their 4 different sizes, which are official forms. It may be hard to tell which is which when you encounter them in the wild. You have to estimate which they are because each size is called small, average, large, and super size. And of course, even after you catch them, it's really hard because it's not like you're going to find a label anywhere other than the Pokedex, and you're going to have to catch all 4 before the Pokedex will tell you that you have all 4. But still, one trick is that the super-sized Pumpkaboo is the only one which holds a Miracle Seed. So if you have a Pokemon with Frisk, which Pumpkaboo gets, by the way, you could Frisk the Pumpkaboo that you encounter in the wild, and if it says it's holding a Miracle Seed, then you got yourself a super size. The difference between these is not just aesthetic. When it comes to Pumpkaboo, the bigger it is, the slower it is, but the higher its attack stat. And as for Gourgeist, it's the same, with the bigger it is, the slower it is, and the higher its attack stat, but it also has increased, if I remember correctly, HP, or maybe it was defense, I can't remember. The point is that if you want a slower but harder hitting Pokemon, you probably want the bigger sizes, but if you want a faster but not as hard hitting Pokemon, then you want the smaller sizes because they're the fastest. Next we have Lycanroc. Lycanroc cannot be changed between these forms, because if they could, then that'd just be weird. And we got, of course, Midday, Midnight, and Dusk Lycanroc. Everyone knows the details. Next, we have Minior. Now, I'm not referring to the difference between Core Minior and Shielded Minior, because that is a different category. That's a changeable form. I'm talking about the permanent colors of Minior. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet are the 7 varieties of Minior, which you can only see after you catch it because they're always shielded in the wild before anything else, unless you damage it without making it faint. And these 7 colors are permanent. You cannot change them. So they are a permanent form. Next we have Magearna, which is also illegitimate because it was never distributed, even though it looks like it was intended to at some point. But the point is that the Pokeball pattern Magearna, which was seen in the movie, including it, and even though it looks like it's a shiny form of Magearna, it's not. It's an ancient form of Magearna before its paint wore off. It was never distributed, even though the code exists in the game. So it is illegitimate, so you can't obtain it legally. Shiny Magearna, of course, exists for both of them.